In the massive, tangled web that is the JonBenet Ramsey case, there's one piece of evidence that's always been a source of intense debate: a single, small piece of black duct tape. Today, in this explainer, we're going to peel back the layers on this one critical clue.
And we have to start right here with this absolutely baffling statement from John Ramsey. How can something be very firm and yet just come off? This contradiction from the very man who found her really sets the stage for a puzzle that investigators even now are trying to solve.
All right, so here's our first key fact. From the very first moment, the evidence was compromised. To understand the tape, you have to understand that the crime scene it came from was contaminated almost instantly, complicating everything for years.
Now, look at this timeline because it is just lightning fast. John finds his daughter. Less than a minute later, he rips the tape off her mouth. Then he says he just discarded it, couldn't recall where. A little while later, his friend Fleet White Jr. actually picks it up, then drops it again. And the crucial part? No one's wearing gloves. You can just imagine any potential intruder evidence, fingerprints, DNA, being wiped away and their own being added to the mix.
And this is the question that just hangs over everything, isn't it? Was this the gut reaction of a panicked, grieving father? A desperate, understandable act? Or was it something else? A subconscious, maybe even a conscious move to destroy a piece of evidence?
So now for our second key fact, and this one's a head-scratcher. John Ramsey's own description of the tape was, well, unusual. His memory seems almost impossibly specific in some ways, and yet completely contradictory in others. Just look at this. On one hand, he's talking about this unusual, maybe sailboat tape that was cut perfectly. But then he says, wait, you never use duct tape on a boat, and that the tape in the evidence photos doesn't even look right. He's floating these ideas about some special black tape, but also insists they only had your standard gray duct tape in the house. You can see why investigators saw these not just as a fuzzy memory, but as some pretty serious red flags.
Think about this detail for a second. It's so clinical. He remembers that it wasn't just torn off a roll, it was cut perfectly to fit her mouth. And that just raises the question: how do you remember something that precise, yet you can't recognize the tape in a picture? It's a level of detail that investigators found really perplexing.
Okay, key fact number 3. All these inconsistencies, they pushed investigators to think about a totally different angle. What if the tape wasn't a real tool used by a kidnapper? What if its only job was to be a prop, a piece of staging?
The logic here is pretty straightforward, right? A gag is for silencing someone, but according to John Ramsey himself, the tape just came off. It failed at its one and only job. So if it wasn't functional, what was it? Well, investigators were left to wonder if its real purpose was just for looks, to make it seem like an intruder had been there.
And honestly, this is the question that really puts a dent in the whole intruder theory. Why would any kidnapper who's broken into a house to commit a crime bring a tool that is totally useless for what they needed to do? It just doesn't add up. Unless, of course, the person putting it on never needed it to stick in the first place.
That brings us to our fourth key fact: the origin of the tape itself. Because when investigators tried to figure out where it came from, they ran into conflicting stories. And what they felt was, well, a kind of smokescreen.
So you've got 3 different narratives here. You've got the investigators, whose forensic work showed the tape didn't match anything else in the house. You have Patsy, who flat out denied ever owning or using that kind of tape. And then you have John, who on one hand says the killer must have brought it, but on the other hand starts speculating, well, maybe it's sailboat tape, maybe it's Fleet's. He was pointing to all these outside sources. And for police, that was a pattern worth noting. And this quote from John's own book really highlights the contrast that bothered investigators. Publicly, he states with absolute certainty that the killer brought the tape. But privately with police, he's throwing out these uncertain theories. This kind of discrepancy made them wonder, was he trying to find the truth, or was he trying to build a very specific story?
And that leads us to the 5th and final fact, the one that comes from the forensics lab. Because what they did find on that tape turned out to be way more explosive than any missing DNA ever could be. So let's get this straight first. The lab that did the testing ultimately said the tape just wasn't a good surface for pulling DNA. So one door closed. There was no DNA from some unknown male, no DNA from an attacker found on the tape. Period. But here's the thing. Just because there was no DNA, it doesn't mean the tape was clean. Not at all. In fact, they found something else. Microscopic, but incredibly powerful. They found trace evidence. And this is it. This is the bombshell. An investigator in a 2000 interview confronted Patsy Ramsey directly with this finding. Fibers from her jacket were found on the duct tape that is found on the mouth. Let that sink in.
They're saying fibers from Patsy's own clothing were found physically stuck to the sticky side of that tape.
Now, the family's legal team, years later in Burke Ramsey's lawsuit, pushed back, but they focused on a different set of fibers, some brown cotton fibers that couldn't be traced to the house. But you see what that defense does? It creates a distraction. It talks about these unidentified brown fibers, but it completely sidesteps the much bigger question, what about the other fibers? The ones investigators said came directly from Patsy's jacket?
So where does all this leave us? Well, when you start stacking these 5 facts up, one on top of the other, the duct tape stops looking like some random clue. It starts to look like the key to the entire crime. Let's just run through it one more time. The application, meticulous, cut, not torn. The adhesion, terrible, it wasn't functional. The origin stories, all over the place. And the fibers, well, they allegedly connected directly to Patsy Ramsey. For many, many people involved in this case, each of these facts was another nail in the coffin for the intruder theory, and another piece of evidence for staging.
And the conclusion that so many have come to is this. The tape was never meant as a tool of violence. It was a tool of deception, put there for one reason, to create a false story and point everyone in the wrong direction.
And that leaves us with a final chilling question. If this one single crucial piece of evidence was staged, what else was? The ransom note? The garrote? Suddenly you have to look at the entire crime scene and ask yourself, what was real?